Alright, in this video we are gonna try to convert an asset that is definitely not meant for games into something that a real-time game engine can handle. More specifically, we are gonna try to bake the details of this highly detailed model into a normal map that will basically store some detailed information into an image that is a special data image that will reflect light as if it was essentially giving the illusion that a low poly model has many more polygons than it really has. So a preface is, and we're going to try to do something similar with the ambient occlusion to add some shading in addition to the real-time calculated shades. Real-time calculated shadows. So the premise is that I beg you once again to not use photogrammetry models. This is a model that has been scanned from a real, a real sculpture. And if you visualize the wireframe, this is how it looks. You kind of like see that it has been scanned because humans don't really produce something like this. So this is already a problem. It's something that is meant for archival purposes. It's meant for, essentially for studies, for digital preservation, and so on. And also, photogrammetry is a photographic process. So artistically speaking, is like, it's almost like you're making a painting and incorporating a photo inside the painting, like making a mixed media. Which has its own significance. It comes with its own sort of like baggage as a photographic process. So this is not a guardian lion. This is a very specific marble Chinese guardian lion located in the front of Era's Prestock Historical Library in Hooksett, North NH. Is it like what? No, New Hampshire, probably. It's got a history. It's got probably stolen at some point. You don't want your game to be essentially the equivalent of the British Museum, in which you're sort of like going around and stealing, columns and stuff, and then reassembling them and putting them out of context, so you can have, some kind of like shooter with some historical flavor or some kind of like exotic flavor. So be aware of that. However, this process can be useful because you might end up having a very high poly model, a bit like this, if you are actually sculpting. So sculpting is a very common process. It's very relatively intuitive. So you might end up making stuff through sculpting, and so through having like a lot of very fine details that are in as essentially as mesh, and you have to sort of like downscale that model and turn it into something that is usable, that can be rendered real time. All right, how do we go about? So by the way, like this is a polygon, like this is a model that has like exactly 1 million triangles. So that's a lot. If you look up, Sketchfab or other places, you will find a gazillion guardian lions. Some of them might even be the same exact statue that has been scanned. Some of them might be already lower poly, or might be already sort of like treated to be a little bit more handleable, a little bit more manageable. And this one here is also kind of like much smaller and quite decent, I would say. And then there's this one here that you see that has a very different mesh, because it was probably created from scratch. It was probably sculpted by an actual human. It does look like something made by a human. It's still pretty high poly, but this is something that you can handle much better. And it's $15, so it's up to you to figure out if you want to spend $15 for a model. Consider that $15 is what is considered minimum wage, an acceptable federal minimum wage for workers at McDonald's and things like that. So they are fighting for having $15 an hour. So are you going to spend an hour going through this process or creating your own? If you're going to spend more than an hour, probably $15 is a totally acceptable cost to pay to not have to spend an hour. And it depends on what your obviously creative goal is. If you just want this thing because you need to tell a story or create an environment, or if you want to learn how to make your own assets. Anyway, I digress. Let's go back to this model here. I downloaded it, and let's assume that this model is really important. You need to have it in your game or in your virtual installation. I installed it, I opened it in Blender, imported in Blender, and this is how it looks. It's gigantic because probably was made with a program that was not Blender. So I'm gonna scale it down quite a bit. I'm gonna actually create a cube that gives me a sense of like that's 1 meter, 1 yard. So I'm gonna try to make it more or less what I imagine this to be. I actually don't know exactly how big this thing is, but I'm assuming it's maybe something like that, something that will be at the entrance of a temple, maybe, who knows. Anyway, something that is more or less manageable and it doesn't completely go out of scale and doesn't clip. I'm also straightening it up. The other thing that I'm gonna do, I'm gonna apply the scale because I think it might affect some remeshing thing. So now it's I reset the scale. This is its natural scale at this point. So this process is an advanced process, but if you follow it step by step, you should be able to do it and apply it to many things. It's essentially a workflow, and I found several tutorials. You will find several other tutorials that have like slightly different variations of this. This is what I found it works. So the first thing about meshes and geometry here, 1 million triangles. I'm gonna make a copy of this since I might make something that is destructive. So I'm gonna just like duplicate it with Command D. By the way, when you're duplicating, you see that I didn't even click anything, but it sort of like sticks to your mouse. If you don't like this behavior, you can right click and the duplication will sort of like stay in place. The clone will stay in place. So I'm gonna then move it using the axis movement here. And I'm just gonna hide. It's just my backup because yeah, I want to preserve it. So in order to have to do this sort of like detail transfer, this conversion here, I need to have the original model or the model with all the details and a low poly model, which is the geometry, the mesh that will go actually in my game. So I'm gonna make another copy here and gonna just like drag it next to it for comparison purposes. There are a few ways to create, automatically create a high poly to low poly. You could even, in some cases, you can even perhaps create your own manual version of it if you really want a clean mesh. So you might end up modeling and using some sort of like tracing techniques, maybe like shrink wrap techniques to create your own lion from scratch that matches this one here. But there are also automated processes that I'm going to show you. So one process that you could use is the remesh. You can remesh from here, or you can remesh from a modifier. Now the premise here, the preface here is that remesh can be a very, especially when you have a million triangles, remesh can actually crash your computer. It can be a very expensive, intensive process. Actually, maybe I'm gonna import. I'm gonna see if I have a model that makes some kind of sense. Sorry about the. I'm gonna maybe open a banana of some sort to show you just how the remesh works without. Let's grab some banana from previous video. Maybe this was the cursed Microsoft banana that looks like crap. No, actually no, this is a pretty decent one. Anyway, so this is just to show you how the remesh works as a modifier, and I already know that it's not gonna crash my computer because it's small. Apply modifier remesh. So there are different kinds of remeshing algorithms. This one here turns into blocks. You can change the scale essentially of each block. You can try a smooth one, which will make more sense for this shape probably. You can try a sharp one. So various algorithms to essentially recreate this object. I did something. I did something silly, so maybe my computer will crash now. Did it crash? And my Blender crashed, and that's exactly what I was trying to avoid. But let's turn this into a teaching moment. What happened here? Well, I applied a modifier, kind of like a very intensive modifier, like decimate could also be quite intense, but I did a remesh modifier. And the modifier instantly applies, and hopefully the default value is reasonable. But then what I did was just, since I'm used to, I changed this variable by dragging and dropping, and I got to a very small voxel size that basically exponentially required more computing power, and probably I did it since Blender tried to do it in real time. It didn't wait for me to finish the end of grabbing. I basically overloaded Blender with a lot of operations. So the proper way to do this is to use, instead of grabbing, sort of like dragging this slider variable, it's either you type the number or you do maybe step by step. So you do like one step, all right, so far so good, one other step. And so in that way, you're reasonably sure that you are sort of like just incrementally changing it. If I jump from 0.08 to 0.00001, it might just like start to voxelize in a way that sort of like breaks things. So just like use this like little arrows here for anytime you have like a very intense process. All right, so why would you want to remesh a mesh? Well, sometimes, especially for like those like terrible photogrammetry model that are not made for video games or anything creative, sometimes they are like missing phases, missing parts. They are not closed. They are not watertight. Because being a photography, they might be, oh, this half of the statue was against a wall or something, so they got like holes like that. So the remesh can actually fix that, because it's, oh no, actually it does not. Okay, yeah, it can actually fix that, because it's sort of like figures out a way to fill the gaps and makes a shape that is always watertight, let's put it that way. So if you're using a model that is sort of like broken that way, maybe do a pass with a remesh before you do everything I'm gonna talk about today. I noticed that this model here is probably has already been remeshed. Maybe it was even higher poly, or in any way it has been fixed, probably with some kind of like photogrammetry software. So it doesn't need to be remeshed, in my opinion. So I'm gonna skip this process, but just mention it because remesh is also a way to essentially reduce the poly count. The other one is decimate, which is the one I'm gonna use for this particular case. The fact that my Blender crashed reminds me that maybe this is a good time to save, since I'm gonna do some potentially risky operations. So I'm gonna just save it, and I'm gonna save it in my playground process, in my assets. So I'm gonna save it as Guardian, or actually I'm gonna call it Guardian Production, since this is not the actual asset I'm gonna use in the game, because it's gonna contain both the high poly and the low poly. So I'm gonna save it as that. So let's make a quick low poly version of this. Let's hope it doesn't crash again. So duplicate. I'm gonna make a copy of it for comparison purposes, but also want to preserve the original one. And I add a decimate modifier. Because I'm using triangles, I'm not gonna even try to unsubdivide. It's definitely not gonna work. I think it's not gonna work, so I'm just gonna use the normal decimate. And here again, I'm not gonna drag this bar here to, avoid that problem. I'm just gonna do like a ratio of 0.1. So decimating 0.1 means retain only 10% of the polygons, and see how it looks. This will take a while. It potentially could crash a small computer, but in this case, yeah, it wasn't too bad. It took a while. All right, so is this game ready? Is this a game worthy polygon mesh? Well, I think it's still pretty high poly. It really depends on what your project is. If you're entering a scene and this is your main subject, the main subject of the scene, you can keep it this high poly. If it's like gigantic and you're sort of like walking around like I don't know, Shadow of the Colossus or something, you can do that. But in this case, I'm assuming that this is more of a prop, environmental prop, so I'm gonna make it much smaller. Let's see how it looks with 0.01%. Because this is a modifier, the 0.1% applies to the original one. I'm still, if you go to edit mode, I still have all of my triangles here. So I'm not applying it cumulatively. The 0.01 doesn't apply to the already decimated one. Let's see. Okay. So is this game ready? Well, yeah, sure. It can even probably be even more actually, because I want to really give you an idea of how much you can get away with normal maps, really. So I'm gonna make it even more extreme. So this one I'm gonna temporarily disable. And also I'm going to smooth it as well. Actually, maybe I'm gonna smooth it after I apply the decimation. So I'm gonna go back to edit mode, to object mode. Yeah, back to object mode, and so this could be a style, a very like crystal-y style, but that's not what we are going for. We want to retain as much detail and be somewhat photographic, somewhat realistic. So I'm gonna keep it like that and see if it works. I'm sort of like looking to make sure that there's no like significant broken stuff happening. No, but it seems still like a proper model. All right, I'm gonna just apply this decimate and call it a day. I'm applying the decimate, so this is sort of like, this is for real. So if I go to edit, it will take a while. If I go to edit, it will actually show me the model as it is. I might even want to give it a auto smooth and see how it looks with auto smooth. Does it look like anything? And maybe like smooth the face, shade smooth. Yeah, doesn't look that great anyway. So that's fine, let's keep it that way. Oh yeah, I guess that will be the auto smooth. All right, let's keep it that way. I'm a bit concerned about whatever this thing is, but whatever. So let's say this is gonna be my low poly. How do I transfer this detail from point A to point B? All right, there are a few processes. There are a few steps that you sort of have to follow, like a recipe, or like a very finicky baking recipe. One thing is you want these two meshes to occupy the same space, to be essentially overlapped. In order to do so, I'm gonna use an absolute grid snap. I'm gonna move this to the center, and then I'm gonna move this to the center. Actually, move this to the center, so now they are overlapped. You sort of like see the differences. Obviously the low poly is sort of like not matching some parts. Then I have to open, unfortunately to do this, I have to open the shading window, which is the stuff that I was trying to avoid. I'm gonna select the low poly one and open the shading window, and it's the stuff that I was trying to avoid because I don't want to really talk about shaders. But since we are doing a shading process, baking means rendering some parts of your scene into a texture. So I'm gonna, let me get rid of this panel here. I don't care about looking at my join areas, blah. Looking at my files. So in order to bake, I need to basically create a slot for the normals, the normal map, and that's going to be a texture. So now, as I guess like the shader comes with, I'm gonna just even like create a new material, sort of like gonna get rid of the default material. So it does have a texture, but I don't care about it. So let's start from a more like generic material and see how it looks in the shading workspace. Yeah, that's kind of like how it looks. Principal BD SF. So I need to create basically a slot for my normal image, and then if you're doing ambient occlusion, I'll do basically the same thing. So how do you do it? First, you add a node to your shader. The node is going to be normal map. The normal map is here. The normal map has to be connected because there are many ways to calculate normals. In this case, we are using an image. The other thing you want to do is add a slot for your image texture. So texture, image texture here, and then you put it here, and you can connect it here for now, but we're gonna connect it and disconnect it. Something will change, but it doesn't matter. A couple of things you need to do here. You want to create a new image, so this actually creates a kind of like an image file, and I'm gonna call it Guardian Normal. I'm gonna increase the size. By default is 1K, but 1024, but I can make it a little bit bigger. It's never really a problem in Unity when you have a texture that is too big, because the textures will be downscaled according to your settings anyway, so it doesn't hurt to make it a little bit bigger. In this case, I'm using this funny system to just basically put in a little equation there, the little mathematical formula. I'm multiplying this number by 2 because I'm lazy. I don't want to type 2048. So 2048, and the alpha color, that's not important, and then I can click OK. So the other thing you want to do is to change the color space. The color space is going to be non-color because this is not really a visual texture, an albedo texture. It's going to be a diffuse texture. It's going to be essentially data. And I think it's that non-color data. I think maybe it's enough for now. So let's try to bake and see what happens. So one thing is I'm gonna actually, the other thing you want to do is go to the image editor here, and you want to see what you are baking. So now since we created this Guardian Normal, by default is a black image, you can select it, and this will be a representation of my normal. So we will see the result of the baking, and we'll be maybe able to analyze it just even visually. In order to bake, we have to do a couple of things. We have to select both meshes, making sure that the low poly mesh is selected, I believe, second, because the process is selected to active. So the active object should be the yellow one, and the selected is the more like orange one. In fact, at this point, I'm gonna change my names. I'm gonna call it Guardian Low Poly, so I don't get confused. And then I'm gonna call Guardian High Poly. You can have even like potentially many intermediate states of high poly, low poly if you're doing LODs, sort of like optimization things, but let's not get into that. So again, you want to select, make sure that you shift select both, but the low poly, that's the target, has to be the active one. That's the one that will be the recipient of the baking. So I'm going to go back to shading, which is I mean, you can do this process anywhere you want, but I kind of like the fact that I get to see this thing here. So baking is part of the render properties because it's a rendering process. So I'm going to go to render properties here, and I'm going to do a few things. Let's see if I remember what the process is. So you want to change the render engine to cycles. Maybe you can do it with other engines, but all the tutorials I saw were mentioning cycles. So switch it to cycles, open the bake tab here, and select the type of baking. In this case, we want to bake one texture, one normal map at a time, one thing at a time. So in this case, we're just gonna check the normal. So we are baking a normal. The type of baking is going to be selective to active. And I'm gonna open this. So meaning that the selected, the orange one, will be baked into the active. And here, I hope it will appear here, and I hope the material is assigned, but it should be assigned. There are two parameters here that I'm not actually going to adjust because I kind of want to show you what they are. Actually, I have no idea what max ray distance is, but definitely extrusion can affect your baking process. And ideally, if now I hit bake, it should bake the texture. It tells me here circular dependency for image Guardian normal for object Guardian low poly. This is because the image here is connected. So it throws you a warning. It shouldn't be a problem, but if you don't want to see that warning, you can disconnect it for the process of baking. I don't think it should be a problem, but let's disconnect it so it doesn't complain. So texture bake, it might take a while depending on you know, how detailed it is. And here we can see our result. And by the way, it tells you baking map, make sure that you save it externally, which is something that we are going to do in a second. So if I'm looking at this normal map here, it just doesn't look quite right. It's kind of like really messy, and there are entire areas that are not really how can I say, that are flat. So it seems that something went wrong, and my guess is that I didn't change the extrusion, and so those parts here that are sort of like elevated compared to the original are not going to get, those details are not going to get transferred. So one thing that I want to do is, well, let's try to change the extrusion and make it, I don't know, 0.5 meter, and let's see what happens. I'm gonna hit bake again. That extrusion might actually slow down the process. All right, my guess was correct. Now the baking produced this result here that is much closer to a normal map. There are some weird areas here that I don't quite understand that are a bit concerning, but let's see what the result is. In order to see the result, I'm going to temporarily hide the high poly version, and I'm going to select the low poly version, and I'm going to replug the normal from here to here. And as you can see, this is the low poly. As you can see, the baking kind of worked pretty well. So even though it's low poly, I managed to transfer some significant detail, like all this stuff here that was like super intricate, to a low poly model. It's a bit pixelated, but hey, that's probably gonna happen. So that's good. It's probably ready to be transferred to, let's say that it worked and it's ready to be transferred to Unity. So I'm going to just select the low poly version, and I'm going to export it as FBX. I don't really want to use the whole blend file. I mean, I could create a different blend file. I don't want to just export both of them because I want to literally get rid, not see the high poly ever again because it's gigantic. So I'm gonna just call it Guardian, and I'm going to say export only the selected object, the one that is currently selected here, and I'm just going to export the mesh. So all the stuff, camera, lamp, or whatever, I'm not exporting. The other settings should be fine. And then I export the FBX. So here it appears. Should be imported here in Unity. Here I created just like a new empty scene. I put my own custom background because I don't like the default one. It's taking way too long. I'm wondering if I did something wrong. Oh, because it's importing also the Guardian production.blend. Probably this blend file, you might want to keep it outside of the file because now it's sort of like a cranking all the million polygons of the other model. But anyway, now I have an FBX that I can just like drag and drop here, and this is the crappy one. This is the one that I decimated, so it's normal that it doesn't look right, and that's because the normal map has not been applied yet. So in order to apply it, I want to save it. So one thing that is kind of bizarre about Blender is that it doesn't really exactly save. I don't exactly know where this image is, let's say that I just want to get out of Blender as soon as possible and not rely on whatever this thing is. So I'm gonna just go to image. Probably this asterisk is here to tell me that this image was never saved, and I'm gonna just save this image as an external file so I can reconstruct this. So I'm going to call it Guardian Normal. That's the name I gave it at the beginning. I'm going to save it as image. Now I go back to Unity, and this image here is here. So this image here is texture type as default. I should probably turn it into normal map, but I'm going to show you what happens if you forget to do this, which is there is like a little button to fix it. So I imported this low poly model here. I'm going to replace the material. So for some weird, Unity quirk, you cannot change a material, the default material of whatever you imported. In order to change the properties here, you have to create a new material from Unity. So create new material. I'm going to call it Guardian. I'm going to drag and drop it, or attach it to it. You see that it's slightly different from Unity's interpretation of a Blender material, but whatever. And then I can collapse it here. The standard material has a slot for the normal map, so I can just drag and drop the normal map here, or select the normal map. You might not see the normal map here because it's not marked as normal map. So it's, Unity still thinks that this is just a albedo texture. So I'm going to just drag and drop and see what happens. See, this texture is not marked as normal map. Fix it now. So this is just basically a gentle thing that Unity does to remind you that to do that. So like fix it. And you can see that now I sort of like reinstated or transferred all these details to the model. So now it looks a lot like what I had here in Blender. So this is actually pretty cool. And because it's a normal map, it will react to the light. So if my light rotates, these details are actually responding to the light. It's not just a texture or like a color texture. The color texture is something that can be added to it in addition to that, if you want like a gritty stone texture, or if you want to change the color. Those are things that you can do independently from the normal map, and you can make it shiny, golden, and whatnot. So this worked out. If you get very close, it will look a little bit pixelated, and maybe there are some ways to do that, but I don't think it will get much better than that. Let me show you another thing you can do when you are like with the same process essentially. Go back to Blender and do the same thing with ambient occlusion. So I'm gonna add a node to my shader. I'm gonna call it ambient occlusion. I guess it's gonna be color, and I'm gonna put it in base color. I don't think it even matters for our purposes, but it has to be there, I guess. And then I'm gonna add texture, what is it? A image texture here, like I did before. And oh, what have I done? Okay, I kind of accidentally connected it. Color to color. You know, maybe some of these processes can even be skipped if you're not really staying in Blender, if you're just moving immediately to Unity. But the important thing is that you definitely have to create a texture here. I'm gonna call it Guardian underscore AO ambient occlusion. The size is the same. Okay, I think the color space can be super RGB or whatever. Important thing, I'm gonna switch it to this thing here so I can see the result of my baking. And now I go back to my baking render properties, bake properties, and so on. And the bake type, instead of the normal, I can just do ambient occlusion. So the ambient occlusion is basically the baseline light that you will have if you have the baseline shadows that you will have on a model if the light was sort of like shining from all directions. Basically, this in order to simplify or to make the lighting more realistic, you can use a texture to save the shadow that will happen sort of like naturally, for example, in the creases and little like hidden areas like the mouth. It's actually easier if you see in action. So bake type, ambient occlusion, the settings should more or less be the same, should work as the same way. Just make sure that you are again selecting the high poly and then the low poly. So the low poly is yellow, and then you go back to shading, and then you hit bake, and then you look at the Guardian AO. Says circular dependency. I'm just gonna disconnect here, and then I'm gonna hit bake. It will take a while. And here too, if you have seen ambient occlusion texture, you should be able to instantly recognize it worked or it went horribly wrong. Consider that because it's photogrammetry, the UV map of this 1 million polygon, 1 million triangle lion is very messy, and it's not like unwrapped in a nice way. You can try to unwrap your own way, but it will probably never look like a lion. It's kind of like very poorly optimized. But I can sort of like see here, since I see like it seems to make a lot of sense, even if it's all like scattered around. I see shadows here, and that's exactly how an ambient occlusion texture looks like. Same thing here. I save this image, and I save it as Guardian AO, ambient occlusion. Then I go back to Unity, and I assign it to the occlusion. So I can drag and drop it to the occlusion. So what happened here? Well, let's make it maybe a little bit brighter. I kind of like added some shade. I almost like increased the shadows, but it's actually a little bit more than that. It's not just amplifying the shadows, but amplifying the shadows where it matters, where the engine might struggle to be realistic. For example, yes, you can sort of like see that there is one directional light, which is kind of like simulating the sun, but you see that the mouth is not as dark as it should be. You see that when you have an area that is all in the shade, there is it's kind of like uniform. It's got like a weird glow, probably coming from, I don't know, the skybox or some diffuse light. So it just doesn't look quite right, even if it's a realistic simulation of the light. So the occlusion sort of like darkens these parts here that will be much darker and makes it way more photorealistic and way more accurate. Actually, ambient occlusion is used a lot for even stylized cartoon styles because it kind of like looks nice. It looks a little bit more like deeper, and it can be also stylized. So ambient occlusion pushed to the max, and we kind of like successfully turned an unusable 1 million trace model to a, how big is that? Let's see, I'm selecting it and seeing here, wait, I'm gonna go to edit mode. 4,000 and basically 5,000 trace. It's still a pretty high definition model, but it's definitely manageable by my engine. I can make a whole bunch of them and it will not crash my computer. And also I can apply a mesh collider to make it solid if I wanted to, which is something I could not have done with a much higher poly object. So I hope it works. It's convoluted. There are a whole bunch of other tutorials. There is even a little plugin that I haven't tried called JBake Tools, which might sort of like streamline, might automate all these processes. But still, like, you kind of have to know how it works behind the scene in order to prepare your models properly. So you're not going to get away with a one-click solution because there are some things that you will have to tweak. All right.